Simone does some decorating, mostly. Nothing serious.
How nice. It's good she has a hobby while you handle the real work.
Simone had heard herself described this way at enough dinners to stop flinching at it out loud. But the concept sketch Una had just pulled up on the projector screen. The load-bearing curve, the atrium's asymmetric skylight angle. The exact proportions she'd drawn on a napkin at her own kitchen table 18 months ago. Was not a hobby, and it was not, whatever Una was about to claim in front of the room, hers either. Una simply had no idea she was about to present someone else's work to the one person alive who could prove it. Simone Reed had come to structural architecture the hard way, which was the only way anyone she knew had come to it. Graduate school in New York, a cohort of 11, 3 of them women of color, herself included. She had watched 2 of the other 3 fight publicly, correctly, for credit on projects that had quietly gone to male colleagues with fewer hours logged and louder voices in the room. And she had watched both of them lose the fight and, within 2 years, lose their careers along with it. Blacklisted in the specific quiet way an industry blacklists people without ever writing the reason down. She had made her own decision after that, not proudly, not as a point of principle, just as a form of self-preservation. She would do excellent work and let very few people know exactly how much of it was hers. She had met Junho during her final year of that graduate program. At a lecture neither of them had particularly wanted to attend that evening. He was finishing an architecture fellowship, quiet in the specific, careful way of someone raised to let his work speak first before he ever did. They married 3 years later, and when his father's small soul firm needed someone to take it over after a sudden diagnosis, Simone had said yes to the move before he'd even finished asking the question, because she loved him, and because some part of her, if she was honest, had also been looking for a reason to step back from a field that had already cost 2 people she respected everything they'd built. In Seoul, she consulted freelance under Reed Design Studio, a name generic enough that most people who hired her assumed it was a small local decorating business, rather than the same structural mind behind 2 award-winning public installations back in the U.S. A community arts pavilion in Chicago and a transit hub skylight system in Austin, both credited, in the public record, to a firm that had absorbed her early designs and quietly kept her name off the press materials. She had let it go. Fighting it would have cost more than the credit was worth. Or so she'd told herself often enough that most days she believed it. At home, she and Junho still worked the way they always had. Evenings at the kitchen table, his sketchbook and her tracing paper, ideas moving back and forth between them so naturally that neither of them tracked anymore, whose hand had drawn which line first. He knew, in the vaguest sense, that she used to do architecture. He had never asked, in any real depth, why she'd stopped, and she had never quite found the sentence that would explain it without also asking him to carry some of the weight of what it had cost her. 5 years in, it had simply become one of the rooms in their marriage neither of them walked into. She had told herself, in the early years, that this was only a temporary arrangement, that she'd surely find her footing again once the move properly settled, once his father's firm stabilized, once there was room in either of their busy schedules for a conversation that wasn't only about deadlines. The years had a way of not waiting for the right moment to arrive on their own. She kept a small drawer in their kitchen desk, locked, where she filed away the parts of her old career. She wasn't ready to look at often. The napkin sketches that had become real buildings under someone else's name. The 2 award announcements she'd read online alone, at night, without telling anyone she'd once had a hand in either project. She told herself the drawer wasn't hiding. It was just filing. She was aware, most days, that this was a distinction she had invented for her own comfort, and not one that would have held up to much scrutiny from anyone who actually looked closely. Junho's firm, meanwhile, had grown slowly but steadily under his direction. Competent work, careful client relationships, nothing flashy, exactly the reputation his father had built it on. The Cultural Center bid was the first project ambitious enough to change the size of what the firm could become. And Simone had watched him prepare for it with the specific, focused intensity she recognized from her own graduate school years, before she'd learned what that kind of ambition sometimes cost the people who didn't get credited for it. Yoona Cho had dated Junho for 3 years before Simone existed in his life at all. A relationship that had ended on his terms, quietly, the way most things Junho did were quiet, in his second year of graduate school. She had built an accomplished career since procurement lead for the city's cultural development office, respected, sharp, genuinely good at the parts of her job that had nothing to do with him. But there was a specific frequency underneath her professional composure whenever Junho's firm came up in a room. A note that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with a version of herself that had once assumed she'd be the one standing beside him at dinners like this one. She would not have called what she felt resentment. She would have called it, if pressed, a healthy competitive edge. It amounted, in practice, to the same thing. Yoona had built her career the way she built most things. Carefully, deliberately, always with an eye toward the version of the story where she came out ahead. She had watched Junho's small firm from a professional distance for years, tracking its growth the way you track a decision you've told yourself you don't regret. And when the cultural center procurement lead position opened, she had taken it partly for the career step it represented and partly, if she was honest with herself late at night, for the specific satisfaction of being the person in the room whose decision could shape whether his firm succeeded or didn't. She had never fully examined why that mattered so much to her. Examining it would have meant admitting the breakup still occupied more space in her than the years since should have allowed. The cultural center contract was the largest bid Junho's firm had ever pursued, and the dinner where finalists presented their concepts to the procurement committee was the kind of night that decided years, not months. Simone came as his wife, not as staff, seated near the end of the table in a role she had occupied at 100 similar dinners. Present, decorative, useful for small talk, entirely outside the professional conversation happening 6 inches to her left. Yoona presented last. For a rival firm, she had quietly steered through the shortlist process in ways no one in the room could quite point to as improper. The concept she put up on the screen stopped Simone's breath before Yoona finished her first sentence describing it. The atrium's asymmetric skylight, angled to track the seasonal sun path exactly the way Simone had worked out on a napkin at her kitchen table a year and a half earlier, before Junho had even brought the concept into his own office. Yoona described the idea, smoothly, as something she had personally developed with the rival firm's lead designer over 8 months of collaborative sessions. A claim of authorship, not just credit, delivered with the specific confidence of someone who had never once considered that the room might contain the actual source. It was in the middle of that presentation, gesturing toward the skylight angle on the screen as her own insight, that Yoona glanced toward Junho's end of the table and offered the line that would outlast everything
Simone
else
does some
that night.
decorating.
Simone
mostly.
does some decorating,
Nothing
mostly.
serious.
Nothing serious.
How nice.
A small,
It's good she...
indulgent laugh around the table. How nice, someone else added. It's good she has a hobby while you handle the real work. Simone said nothing. She had gotten very good, over 5 years, at saying nothing in rooms exactly like this one. But she watched the skylight rotate on the screen, watched Yoona describe as her own the exact geometry Simone had solved for on a napkin while Junho made tea beside her, and felt something in her that had gone quiet a long time ago start, carefully, to wake back up. She excused herself a few minutes later, ostensibly for the restroom, and stood for a moment in the hallway outside the private dining room, hands pressed flat against the cool wall, breathing the way she used to breathe before graduate school presentations, back when the stakes had felt this large the last time. She thought about the 2 women from her cohort, the ones who had fought and lost everything doing it, and she thought, too, about the version of herself that had decided, 5 years ago, that quiet was safer than a fight she wasn't sure she could win a second time. She was no longer entirely certain that decision still fit the person making it. When she returned to the table, Yoona was finishing the presentation, gesturing toward the skylight's seasonal sun-tracking angle with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to defend an idea she hadn't built. Junho was watching the screen with the specific stillness Simone recognized from years of living beside him. The look he wore when something didn't add up, but he hadn't yet located exactly what. That night, at their kitchen table, the same worn spot in the wood where 100 sketches had been drawn, Simone did something she had not done in 5 years of marriage. She opened a drawer she kept locked and set down in front of Junho the original napkin, dated in her own handwriting, alongside 2 folders. Press clippings for the Chicago Pavilion and the Austin Transit Hub, both crediting a firm that had never once put her name in a byline, and beneath those, her old university portfolio, her actual name on every page. Junho was quiet for a long time. Not angry. She had braced herself for anger and gotten something harder to sit with instead. The specific, unhurried silence of a man realizing how little he had asked her, in 5 whole years, about the things she'd given up to follow him here. "You designed these," he said finally, not quite a question. "Both of them." She nodded. "And I never asked why you stopped," he said, and it wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the beginning of one, the kind that takes longer than a single sentence to actually finish saying. They decided together that night what to do about it. Not confrontation for its own sake, but documentation, the only language Simone had ever fully trusted to hold up under pressure. She reached out the next morning to a former professor who had overseen both original projects and remembered, in detail, whose hand had drawn the early concepts. She gathered the dated sketches, the original project files from her graduate program, the emails from years ago in which the absorbing firm had, in writing, if you knew where to look, referenced S. Reed's initial concept, before quietly dropping her name from every version after. Junho, for his part, did something he had never done in 5 years of running his father's firm. He went back through his own project files and found, in his own handwriting, notes from 18 months earlier crediting S's skylight idea. Angle math, follow-up. A note he had made and then, without any bad intention, simply absorbed into the firm's collective process without ever circling back to name its source out loud, even to himself. It took him most of a night, going through 18 months of notebooks, to understand fully what he was looking at. Not one idea, but a pattern, sketch after sketch across 2 years of projects where the actual structural insight had come from conversations at their kitchen table that he had folded so seamlessly into his own process that he had genuinely stopped noticing where her thinking ended and his began. It was not, he realized, a small oversight. It was closer to 5 years of a habit he had never once examined, because examining it would have required admitting that the firm's growing reputation rested, in ways no one else could see, on work his wife had never been asked to put her name to. He didn't say all of this to Simone that night. He wasn't sure yet how to. But he sat with the notebooks longer than he needed to, and when he finally closed the last one, something in how he looked at her across the kitchen table had shifted in a way neither of them tried to name out loud. The procurement committee's follow-up review meeting was smaller than the dinner had been, and far less performative. Simone attended this time, not introduced as anyone's wife, but seated at the table with her own folder, because Junho had asked her to be there, and because for the first time in 5 years, she had decided the cost of staying quiet had finally outgrown the cost of speaking. She laid out the documentation calmly, without theatrics. The dated napkin sketch, the professor's written verification, the university project file, the quiet paper trail showing her authorship on both the Chicago and Austin installations years before either firm currently at the table had submitted a single drawing. The rival firm, when asked directly to produce an earlier version of their skylight concept predating Simone's sketch, could not. None existed. The math simply wasn't there to be found because it had never been theirs to begin with. The committee didn't need Simone to accuse anyone of favoritism outright. The dates did that work for her. Yuna's role in steering the shortlist came under quiet procedural review in the weeks that followed. Not a public scandal, no headlines, just the specific, permanent kind of professional cost that follows a person through every room they walk into afterward, whether or not anyone ever says its name out loud. It was Yuna, finally cornered by her own paperwork, who at last said the thing underneath all of it, addressing Simone directly for the first time the entire evening. "You got to just disappear into a nice, quiet life," she said, and for a moment the professional composure slipped entirely. "I've had to keep proving myself every single year since he left." Simone didn't answer cruelty with cruelty. She said only, evenly, "Disappearing wasn't a gift I gave to myself." It's what was left over after the other option cost two women I deeply respected their entire careers. I made a choice, and you don't have to respect it. But you don't get to build your whole case for that contract on top of it either. Junho's firm did not win the contract outright. The review process reopened rather than guaranteed anything, and the committee's final decision, when it came weeks later, went to neither firm cleanly, restructured into a joint proposal that folded in Simone's verified original concept under her own name for the first time in 6 years. It was not the triumphant ending a fully public reversal might have offered. It was, in its own quieter way, more permanent than that would have been. Simone did not return to full-time practice overnight. She took one small, deliberate step instead. A formal consulting contract, under her own full name, testing carefully whether an industry that had cost her colleagues their careers had changed, or had only learned to look from a distance like it had. She and Junho did not resolve 5 years of unasked questions in a single conversation at a kitchen table. But they started finally having them, one at a time, without either of them pretending the backlog didn't exist. The story didn't end with Yuna publicly destroyed, and it didn't end with a courtroom vindication scene built for an audience's satisfaction. It ended with something smaller and more lasting. Simone signing a single contract under her own name for the first time in 6 years, and Junho sitting across from her at the same worn kitchen table, asking her, really asking, for what felt like the first time, what she wanted to build next. She didn't have a full answer yet. She told him so, honestly, and he didn't rush her toward one. For the first time in 5 years, that felt less like an ending she was still recovering from, and more like an actual beginning. One she was allowed to take at whatever pace it required, with someone finally asking the question instead of assuming he already knew the answer.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing, as you can ever imagine. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.